Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. And as always, I hope that you enjoy.
Flinch, written by Fisser 946. The Great War had been over and done with for a decade now, but Ulton still felt as though he was fighting it. They'd come over the endless sea in wooden ships with massive sails and laid claim to land that had belonged to the elves for 1,000 generations. Still, they were weak and slow, and the first settlers were driven out to the mountains or back across the endless sea when faced with the strength and speed of the elves. Ulton slapped a few pieces of copper on the counter and started on another drink, the strong, dwarvish ale tickling the back of his throat as he tried to forget the embarrassment of his people. The innkeeper took his old glass and wiped it down with an old cloth, her dwarvish fingers deftly polishing the glass before placing it back on display. A bearded dwarf and an orc in the far corner by the hearth argued in the orcish tongue as they gambled, dicing with the knuckle bones of some unlucky foe. Ulton had fought in the Great War. He had faced the enemy, and fighting them was like child's play. He wondered how they had lost to such a pathetic race. The steady sound of raindrops against the tiles on the roof were interrupted as the door slid open soundlessly on dwarf-made hinges and slammed into the wall. A dark figure stepped through the doorway with a massive wolfhound following closely. The figure turned and shut the door as water dripped from his dark cloak to form a muddy puddle around his well-worn boots. A long sword hung at his left hip and a dagger at the other, and a huge rucksack forced him to slouch. Ulton fingered the pommel of his own sword in its sheath. It was elvish steel, sung from the ironwood and powerful words of the old tongue, as light as a feather, sharper than sin, and far stronger than the black iron that the enemy used. "Excuse me, sir, I heard there was room here for a weary traveller. I got coin." The traveller walked towards the dwarf, procuring a coin purse from deep within the hidden pocket. The dwarf sneered. "That's missed to ya!" The irate dwarf practically growled as she tucked away the cloth into a strap of her brown apron. The newcomer stuttered and stammered an apology. His inability to properly address his potential hostess a clear sign that he was an outsider. Ulton felt disgust as he turned back to his cup. He paused for a moment before thinking better of it and left the cup to sit as he considered the traveller. "I don't know what to say. I'm sorry, milady. Truly, it must have been rain in my eyes or something." The newcomer counted his payment before adding an extra silver piece and pressing it into the dwarf's open hand. "Got your yarmulke ring, for God's sake. Your room's on the second floor, third one to the left down the hall. Dog's got to stay outside, though. You can tie the beastie up in the old barn. No horses in there, so it should be fine." The placated dwarf dismissed her guest as she happily pocketed the extra silver piece before putting the rest of the coins in a hidden compartment behind the counter. The traveller stammered out an apology, commenting on the beauty of his host, before backing out the door with his wolfhound. Ulton tossed back the drink before following. Outside the inn, the grey clouds continued to pour down a torrent of rain, and the muddy ground sucked at his elegant boots. Ulton felt a little dizzy from the drink, but he walked confidently towards the figure by the barn. On all sides, the dark pines threatened to close in, but Ulton took comfort in their presence. Like great sentinels, they were one of the few things that outlived elves, and they would bear witness to the justice he planned on dispensing. The traveller was struggling to tie his massive dog to a post, and as Ulton got closer, he could see that he was missing his forefinger from his right hand, and was clumsily making do with those fingers that were left to him. Pale scars crisscrossed against his dark skin. The traveller had finally threaded the rope through the collar on his dog and tied a knot. He pulled once, then twice, to make sure that it was secure. "Did you lose it in the war?" Ulton asked casually. The traveller in black jumped and fell in surprise at the sound of his voice, turning around onto his back and panting as he clutched at his chest. Up close, he looked much older than Ulton had realized. His coarse beard was still dark brown, but threads of silver had begun lacing their way into the dark locks underneath his rain-soaked hood. A pale thin line was traced along his cheek where the point of a sword had narrowly missed, blinding him. Ulton hadn't aged at all since the Great War, but it looked as though the traveller in front of him had felt the ravages of time more acutely. In the back of his mind, Ulton remembered that his foe was short-lived and aged very rapidly in comparison to his own people. "You shouldn't sneak up on someone like that," said the traveller, struggling to stand. He reached out a hand for assistance, but Ulton denied him. The man finally groaned as he pushed himself onto his own 2 feet. "The name's Eric, just Eric. It's nice to meet you." The man extended a hand in a peculiar gesture, waiting for Ulton to take it and shake it. Ulton simply stared at the man until he lowered his hand. "Well, it's nice chatting with you, mister, but I'm heading inside now. It's awful cold and wet out here. You should come inside." Ulton cut him off with a fist, striking the old traveller in the stomach and sending him to his knees. "Draw your sword," he commanded as his foe gasped for breath. "You couldn't let bygones be bygones, huh? It's been 10 years. The man shouted from his place in the mud, but he stood anyways. He slid his blade from his sheath, the old iron sword glistening from the rain. Ulton could see the telltale sign of an iron sword that had tasted elvish steel. A dozen wedges had been cut into the edge where it had met with a song-forged elvish sword. 10 years is nothing, Ulton declared solemnly as he drew his own sword. 3 feet of golden green steel sung as it slid freely from its sheath. The enemy shouted before rushing forwards, swinging his own sword in a powerful 2-handed arc down at Ulton's head. Ulton knocked it aside with ease. The wolfhound shook the entire barn as it tore free to aid its master, but a word of the old tongue from Ulton sent the dog whimpering with its tail between its legs. It was good to see that even foreign beasts were subject to the powers of the old tongue. The traveller roared again, sending a flurry of sword strikes towards Ulton. He checked each one, almost lazily. His own sword sung each time it struck the hard iron sword, and his foe grunted each time a stroke was suddenly stopped. Ulton was almost bored before he slid close and disarmed his opponent, as he had done thousands of times before. It was pathetic, really. The traveller glared at him from beneath his dark hood as his sword went flying into the dark woods. Ulton raised his sword and pointed it at his chest. He glowered at the traveller with a look of contempt. "Hey, what do you think you're two doing?" The innkeeper hollered from the porch, waving her stunted arms wildly over her head. Behind her, the orc and the bearded dwarf had given up their warm seats by the hearth to watch the fight through the window, no doubt placing bets. The dwarf looked very pleased with himself, having put his money on Ulton. Only an orc would be dumb enough to wager against that. "I'm showing this one his place." Ulton didn't even turn to look at her as he drove the point of his sword against the chest of his enemy. "You know," he said, addressing the foe in front of him, "I'll never understand how your kind won the war. You're slow and weak and—" Ulton's words were cut short as the defeated foe lurched forward, pushing the sword aside with the flat of the 4-fingered hand and burying his dagger into Ulton's neck. Ulton dropped the blade in the mud as he struggled to pull the rough iron knife from his throat. He tried to mutter a few words in the old tongue, something to mend his mortal wound, but the only sound he could make was a gurgle. At this point, his foe was holding him up, and the dwarf had ceased her protests. "And we don't flinch when it comes to killing," the old human whispered in his ear as his lifeblood ebbed through the hole in his neck, and the rain washed his pains away. Inside the inn, the orc was whooping and hollering with laughter as his companion stared on in shock. End of story. I just want to thank the T5 patrons and channel members. Bob the Dragon, Cam Maxwell, Casper Arnholtz, Australia the Dreamer, Tryagain95, Fudic Yol, Meridian117, Alithia, Jordan Bucksbaum, Angry Marine, Albarden Guster, and Barkey. Thank you very much.
And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed. There are links down below, both to support this channel and for the author of this fiction. Anyways, I hope you all have a fantastic one, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.